The digital clock on the encrypted monitor inside the incident command center flipped to exactly 5 in the blockchain does not feel human empathy, and it certainly does not offer any emotional extensions. Public panic and aggressively forced the incredibly private family into a devastating and extremely bright international spotlight. But without a doubt, the absolute most chilling aspect of these public messages was exactly what they completely and totally failed to actually include. There was absolutely zero proof of life provided anywhere within the demands. They aggressively asked for a truly staggering financial fortune, but offered absolutely zero verifiable evidence that Nancy Guthrie was actually still alive after being forcefully abducted and entirely separated from her absolutely critical heart medication for several crucial days. This highly bizarre and disjointed strategy constantly raises a profound and deeply disturbing investigative question. Why exactly would a highly sophisticated criminal enterprise seemingly capable of smoothly utilizing untraceable global cryptocurrency networks actively choose to communicate directly through sensationalist media outlets rather than quietly securing a direct and discreet line of financial negotiation? It strongly and undeniably suggested a terrifying and highly plausible alternate possibility. What if the violent individuals who aggressively breached the physical home in the Catalina Foothills? It only strictly records the cold, hard truth of mathematical transactions, and on this particular tense afternoon, the digital ledger was completely empty. We're absolutely not the exact same individuals who were currently sending the digital ransom notes. What if an opportunistic someone was simply watching the breaking news of the violent abduction on television and immediately saw a perfect opportunity to maliciously exploit the massive tragedy for immense personal financial gain? What do you truly think about this highly unusual decision to send the massive ransom notes directly to the hungry press instead of the waiting police? Leave your best forensic theories down in the comments below right now, because the very next digital footprint discovered in this complex case will completely unravel absolutely everything we just firmly established. Do not forget to gently like the video so the platform algorithm actively knows you deeply value these thorough and deep analytical true crime investigations. The absolute audacity required to carefully hijack a highly publicized kidnapping and completely turn it into a decentralized financial shakedown is truly staggering to comprehend. If the notes were indeed genuine, it clearly meant the captors were arrogant enough to believe their digital anonymity was completely unbreakable. If the notes were a complete fabrication created by a cruel internet scammer, it meant the real violent kidnappers were still out. The total lack of communication following the fiercely anticipated deadline suggested a horrific reality far more devastating than a simple operational delay in negotiations. Their remaining entirely silent, while an imposter actively tried to cash in on the horrific blood spilled in the Arizona desert. This dual reality created a massive and unprecedented headache for the lead investigators. They were essentially forced to actively investigate two completely distinct crimes simultaneously. They had to hunt for a physical body missing in the real world while simultaneously tracking a digital phantom operating within a complex financial matrix. The sudden and explosive introduction of the massive Bitcoin demand instantly forced Sheriff Chris Nanos and the local Arizona detectives to immediately seek highly specialized federal assistance to successfully navigate an entirely new and complex forensic landscape. They were no longer simply looking for physical latent fingerprints or distinct tire tracks left behind in the dry desert dust. They were now actively hunting for invisible digital phantoms, rapidly moving through the highly complex and intentionally deeply obscured pathways of the global blockchain network. Leading cryptocurrency analysts, including respected experts like Ravi Sarathy and Paul Sibenik, have extensively and thoroughly studied the complex underlying mechanics of modern digital extortion, and their professional insights successfully provide a truly chilling context for the overarching strategy of the perpetrators. It heavily hinted that the unidentified individuals currently holding the victim might no longer actually possess a living human asset to bargain with. The specific demand for Bitcoin was absolutely not a random or convenient choice. It was a highly calculated and brilliant maneuver specifically designed to completely eliminate the absolute most vulnerable point of any traditional kidnapping operation, which is the physical exchange of the actual ransom money. In nearly all historical extortion cases, the agreed upon drop-off location was almost always exactly where specialized law enforcement could successfully deploy hidden surveillance teams and physically apprehend the greedy suspects. By actively utilizing a decentralized and heavily encrypted digital currency, the unknown perpetrators entirely and permanently removed the dangerous need for any physical meeting whatsoever. The massive financial transaction could theoretically be processed securely from a simple laptop located absolutely anywhere on the entire planet, successfully providing the extortionist with a formidable and nearly impenetrable layer of pseudo-anonymity. However, the expert analysts also quickly pointed out a massive and glaring logical contradiction embedded deeply in the overall strategy. There was absolutely zero established evidence to ever suggest that the Guthrie family had been specifically physically targeted because they possessed exceptionally large amounts of digital cryptocurrency. Before we can truly begin to untangle this highly complex web of cryptocurrency and thoroughly understand why the perpetrators deliberately chose, this was absolutely not a typical case of wealthy and highly public crypto investors being violently hacked or physically coerced for their private keys. The specific demand for digital virtual currency appeared to be simply the newly chosen operational mechanism of a modern criminal syndicate utilizing the absolute safest possible method to extract massive wealth from a highly desperate and wealthy family. But the entire digital operation completely hinged on one massive and fundamental operational flaw. The Federal Bureau of Investigation always maintains a highly strict and entirely unwavering internal protocol regarding active hostage negotiations and especially ransom payments. They explicitly and firmly advise absolutely against actively transferring any funds whatsoever, and especially irreversible digital currencies, without absolute real-time verification that the hostage is truly alive and physically capable of being safely returned to their family. The complete and total lack of any recent photograph or live audio recording or specific correct answers to verifiable personal questions explicitly meant the frustrated authorities were currently facing a massive and impenetrable digital brick wall, sending millions of untraceable dollars to an anonymous string of alphanumeric code. Without such a convoluted method of extortion, we must first carefully examine the extremely fragile medical nature of the exact person they abducted. Any solid proof of life was simply absolutely not a viable option for the seasoned agents. The lead investigators were hopelessly trapped in an agonizing and seemingly endless operational stalemate. They had a confirmed and highly violent physical crime scene and a confirmed active on-chain digital wallet patiently waiting for funds, but they had absolutely zero connective tissue between the physical, bloody reality of Nancy Guthrie and the digital coded reality of the extortionists. They continuously watched the live blockchain monitor day and night, desperately hoping the arrogant perpetrators would eventually make a critical operational mistake or finally provide a definitive sign of life. The vast network, however, remained completely dark and entirely inactive. The authorities and the grieving family were essentially desperately screaming loudly into a massive digital void and receiving absolutely nothing but cold silence in return. This suffocating and terrifying lack of any forward progress continued endlessly for several agonizing days as the internal biological clock for a frail woman existing without her critical heart medication continued to rapidly and loudly tick away. The blockchain ledger does not ever lie, but the unknown people hiding directly behind its encrypted walls absolutely do. Welcome back to Ronin Noir Files. The entire complex investigation was completely paralyzed by the brilliant but incredibly cruel absolute anonymity of the decentralized digital network. Just as the fading hope of ever successfully making digital contact began to completely evaporate, a tiny and highly unusual digital anomaly suddenly registered on the massive blockchain network, successfully providing a sudden and truly shocking spark to the entirely frozen and hopeless case. The silence of the digital ledger was finally broken by an action that nobody on the investigative team had successfully anticipated. It was a digital maneuver that would force absolutely everyone involved to entirely reevaluate their understanding of who exactly was controlling the narrative of this horrific crime. The entire dynamic of the waiting game was about to shift dramatically. The profound and complete silence radiating from the global digital ledger was suddenly and unexpectedly interrupted on February 10th. A microscopic fraction of virtual currency suddenly materialized inside the designated digital repository. This incredibly tiny financial transfer was reportedly accompanied by a highly specific and direct text message firmly stating that the senders were completely ready to talk and requesting immediate contact. If you truly appreciate rigorous, true forensics over baseless internet rumors, hit subscribe and let us open this file together. According to local broadcast reports, This incredibly small deposit was a calculated tactical maneuver. It was a digital flare aggressively fired directly into the pitch black abyss of the internet. The investigative task force, or perhaps desperate private representatives, were intentionally trying to trigger an active response from the anonymous extortionists. They deliberately needed the suspects to log into the network and view the new transaction. The moment those unknown individuals accessed the account, the authorities theoretically possessed a fleeting opportunity to trace their incoming network connection and potentially pinpoint a rough geographical location. The trap was meticulously set, and the digital bait was officially placed on the open ledger. The entire command center held its collective breath while waiting for the digital trap to spring. However, the agonizing hours quickly turned into excruciating days, and absolutely nothing happened. The perpetrators completely ignored the tiny financial deposit and the attached message. The digital breadcrumbs meticulously left behind in this unprecedented case will permanently challenge absolutely everything you think you currently know about modern technological kidnapping protocols. The digital wallet once again returned to a state of absolute and terrifying dormancy. This complete lack of any reciprocal communication rapidly began to nurture a highly controversial and deeply disturbing alternative theory among the investigative team. The opportunistic scammer hypothesis began to gain massive and undeniable traction. The authorities were forced to seriously consider the horrific possibility that the extremely public demand for virtual currency was nothing more than a cruel and elaborate deception. What if the ruthless individuals who violently breached the local residence possessed absolutely no connection whatsoever to the alphanumeric code broadcasted across national television screens? The high-profile nature of the missing persons report created a perfect and incredibly lucrative opportunity for a totally disconnected digital predator. A highly intelligent criminal sitting in a dark basement halfway across the world could easily watch the breaking news coverage and immediately generate an anonymous digital receiving address within seconds. By aggressively routing their terrifying financial demands directly through prominent media outlets instead of attempting a highly dangerous direct contact with local police, the scammers completely bypassed all traditional security protocols. Every passing second after that deadline felt like a profound defeat for the investigative team. They brilliantly weaponized the immense public panic to manufacture a highly credible threat. This terrifying theory perfectly explained exactly why the alleged captors completely failed to provide any verifiable evidence regarding the physical status of the elderly victim. An opportunistic scam artist operating from a completely different continent simply cannot produce a current photograph of a hostage they do not actually possess. They could only aggressively demand a massive fortune and desperately hope the terrified family would blindly transfer the funds entirely out of sheer panic. The realization that they might be chasing a completely fabricated digital ghost while the actual violent perpetrators remained entirely undetected was a devastating psychological blow to the local detectives. The massive investigation was fundamentally fractured into two completely separate and highly desperate realities. As the agonizing month of February slowly progressed, the completely devastated family decided to aggressively escalate their desperate search efforts. On February 24th, they officially and very publicly announced a massive financial incentive. They formally offered a staggering $1 million public reward for any verifiable information directly leading to a safe and successful recovery. Afternoon, on February 9th, 2026, and an absolutely agonizing silence entirely consumed the room. They were staring at a screen waiting for a digital miracle that simply refused to materialize in the real world. This massive public declaration of available funds was a clear and undeniable act of sheer desperation. It strongly signaled that all private avenues of direct negotiation had completely and totally failed. If the family was currently engaging in a productive back-channel dialogue with the actual captors, they would absolutely never risk severely angering those volatile individuals by publicly broadcasting a massive bounty to the general public. The enormous reward was a final and desperate attempt to completely shake the trees and aggressively encourage absolutely anyone with even a shred of knowledge to step forward. The investigators desperately hoped the massive sum of money would successfully tempt a lower level accomplice or a suspicious neighbor to anonymously contact the authorities. But despite the enormous financial temptation, the local telephone lines remained completely quiet. The massive public reward generated absolutely zero actionable intelligence and produced no credible leads. The entire case was completely paralyzed by a profound lack of physical evidence and an impenetrable wall of cryptographic security. We absolutely cannot begin to understand the profound and calculated cruelty of this specific crime without first the local detectives were completely exhausted and deeply frustrated by the endless dead ends. They needed a massive breakthrough to finally understand the true nature of this complex crime. If you are deeply fascinated by how criminal networks exploit modern technology, please ensure your notifications are fully activated, because the absolute darkest revelation of this entire nightmare is just about to surface. The massive and highly publicized $1 million reward hung heavily over the completely stalled investigation throughout the entire month of March. The authorities and the devastated family were trapped in a horrific state of permanent limbo while desperately waiting for absolutely any credible development. Then, as the cruel month finally began to draw to a close, a massive and incredibly devastating narrative twist completely shattered the lingering hopes of a safe resolution. A brand new and highly disturbing written communication suddenly surfaced and was rapidly leaked directly to the eager national press. This unexpected secondary message reportedly gained massive national traction after being extensively detailed on prominent syndicated broadcast programs. Understanding the brutal biological countdown that was instantly triggered the very second the abduction officially occurred. The anonymous author of this terrifying new document aggressively claimed full and total responsibility for the violent physical abduction that occurred weeks prior. However, this specific message did not contain a renewed demand for massive amounts of virtual currency or aggressive threats of further violence. Instead, it contained a chillingly calm and entirely horrifying alleged confession that instantly reframed the entire context of the frozen investigation. The alleged perpetrators explicitly claimed in the leaked correspondence that they were completely and totally unaware of the extremely severe cardiovascular issues afflicting their elderly captive at the precise moment they initiated the violent residential breach. They claimed the rapid physical deterioration of the hostage caught them completely by surprise. The profoundly disturbing letter then delivered the absolute most devastating psychological blow imaginable to the grieving relatives. The anonymous authors chillingly and explicitly alleged that their frail captive had tragically passed away and subsequently transitioned to a higher spiritual plane. This unverified but deeply plausible written assertion landed like an absolute bomb inside the heavily fortified Incident Command Center. It instantly provided a completely logical and utterly terrifying explanation for the absolute silence radiating from the global digital ledger. At exactly 84 years old, Nancy Guthrie lived a quiet life that was strictly dictated by the unforgiving and relentless rhythm of advanced cardiovascular medicine. If the violent captors truly realized they were suddenly holding a deceased individual, their entire highly sophisticated extortion plot immediately and completely collapsed. A deceased hostage possesses absolutely zero financial leverage in a high-stakes digital negotiation. The anonymous criminals desperately needed their victim to remain physically viable just long enough to successfully extract the massive electronic payment. Once that biological possibility was permanently extinguished, the entire operation became a massive and completely pointless liability. The perpetrators could never ever provide the absolutely critical and mandatory visual proof of life demanded by federal negotiating experts. Therefore, they fully realized that the massive electronic transfer they aggressively demanded would absolutely never materialize under any circumstances. They were left completely empty-handed, holding nothing but a massive and highly radioactive murder investigation. The completely abrupt and permanent abandonment of the anonymous digital repository suddenly made perfect and chilling logical sense. The opportunistic perpetrators simply walked completely away from the designated electronic account because they fully knew the transaction was permanently dead. They completely vanished back into the obscure shadows, leaving behind a devastating and entirely senseless tragedy. She was widely known as the mother of prominent national television anchor Savannah Guthrie, but inside the private walls, this horrific alleged confession resolved the agonizing mystery of the dormant virtual wallet, but it simultaneously birthed a significantly darker and much more complex physical nightmare for the local tactical teams. The completely unverified nature of the leaked correspondence meant the local authorities could not legally or officially declare the intensive search operations permanently concluded. They were now actively hunting for physical remains rather than a living and breathing hostage. The entire scope and fundamental objective of the massive local deployment immediately shifted from an active and highly urgent rescue mission to a grim and incredibly challenging physical recovery effort. The profound emotional devastation inflicted upon the family members was absolutely immeasurable. They were forced to publicly process a highly graphic and incredibly disturbing alleged confession broadcasted widely across international media networks without actually possessing any concrete physical verification to properly mourn their profound loss. The perpetrators executed a highly organized physical extraction, but completely failed to calculate the extreme of her own home. She was simply a vulnerable woman entirely dependent on modern medical science to survive another day. Biological fragility of their target resulting in a totally botched and entirely fruitless criminal enterprise. The investigators completely understood that without locating a physical body, they could never truly close the case or bring the responsible individuals to true justice. The deeply unsettling and totally unverified claims detailed in the late March correspondence forcefully plunged the entire investigation into an agonizing and completely inescapable paradox. The seasoned local detectives were now hopelessly trapped directly between two entirely incompatible and deeply frustrating operational realities. They possessed a highly visible and publicly confirmed electronic receiving address that remained completely and totally frozen in time. They simultaneously possessed an incredibly violent physical crime scene that successfully yielded absolutely zero directional momentum. The total absence of any recovered physical remains made it absolutely impossible to definitively corroborate or entirely dismiss the horrific narrative officially presented by the anonymous authors of the secondary letter. The criminal justice system fundamentally requires tangible and physical proof to successfully pursue severe charges, but the perpetrators successfully executed a completely flawless physical vanishing act. The undeniable and terrifying reality of the missing daily pharmaceutical compounds created a biological absolute that heavily supported the grim and dark allegations made by the extortionists. Her failing heart constantly relied on a surgically implanted artificial pacemaker to constantly maintain a steady and viable electrical rhythm. The mathematical probability of surviving such an extended duration without massive and immediate medical intervention was virtually non-existent. The perpetrators completely bungled the financial execution of their complex plot, but they unfortunately succeeded in completely erasing a human being from the physical world. The lead investigators were forced to systematically scale back the massive daily search operations as the burning hot leads completely evaporated into the dry desert air. The aggressive financial pursuit was completely halted because there were absolutely no active electronic transactions left to securely monitor. The highly sophisticated international syndicate, or perhaps the lone opportunistic digital predator, simply ceased to exist in any measurable or observable capacity. They completely retreated from the massive global stage, leaving the completely devastated family permanently stranded in a state of absolute and total emotional purgatory. The local authorities officially maintained an open and active file, but the daily forward momentum completely stalled. The deeply tragic irony of the entire situation was profoundly difficult for the seasoned detectives to fully process. The unknown suspects constructed an incredibly complex and highly modern digital extortion framework only to see their entire malicious enterprise completely destroyed by a simple and entirely predictable biological reality. This incredibly small electronic device was, however, only one critical part of a much more comprehensive daily medical regimen. They aggressively demanded millions of untraceable dollars, but entirely failed to recognize the absolute physical frailty of the human life they violently stole. The case slowly and quietly transitioned from a massive and urgent international spectacle into a quiet and deeply haunting local tragedy. The empty and blood-stained residence in the affluent neighborhood stood as a permanent and highly visible reminder of the terrifying unpredictability of extreme violence. The family was tragically denied the absolute basic human right of proper closure and formal mourning because the physical evidence required to completely understand the final moments of the horrific ordeal simply vanished without a single trace. They were forced to endure an endless and entirely cruel waiting game, knowing deep down that the biological clock had, unfortunately, expired long before the anonymous digital perpetrators ever officially abandoned their greedy demands. The entire community was left totally grasping for answers that would likely never actually materialize. The complete failure of the law enforcement apparatus to successfully bridge the massive gap between the physical evidence and the digital demands highlighted a terrifying new reality in modern criminal investigations. She absolutely required highly specific prescription medications that had to be taken at exact, predetermined intervals to actively prevent complete and sudden cardiac failure. Traditional police work heavily relies on establishing a clear and undeniable physical connection between the prime suspect and the primary crime scene. But this unprecedented case completely severed that fundamental connection by actively utilizing the absolute anonymity of the decentralized internet. The incredibly frustrating reality remains that the individuals who physically shattered the wooden doors might never face a judge or jury because their identities are perfectly shielded by the same digital network that entirely failed to deliver their demanded ransom. Every single logical avenue of traditional investigation eventually terminated at a completely impassable digital brick wall. The lingering and deeply haunting questions continue to actively torment absolutely everyone involved with this dark file. Did the actual perpetrators panic and flee immediately after realizing their massive and fatal medical miscalculation? Or is the completely dormant virtual account simply waiting for a completely different and totally unexpected criminal enterprise to suddenly spark it back to vibrant life? The profound lack of absolute certainty is the ultimate and most devastating punishment continuously inflicted upon those left behind. What this devastating case fundamentally teaches us about the rapid evolution of modern extortion is profoundly disturbing and entirely relevant to absolute community safety. This critical medical reality serves as the foundational tension of the entire complex investigation. It serves as a stark and incredibly vital masterclass in successfully identifying completely opportunistic digital ransom scams. The absolute core survival lesson directly derived from highly classified federal advisory protocols is the critical necessity of immediate and unquestionable verification. Law enforcement experts explicitly mandate that no desperate family should ever initiate any financial compliance or execute even a preliminary electronic test transfer without demanding simultaneous and entirely irrefutable real-time verification of the physical well-being of the target. In our current highly connected era, absolutely anyone watching a local television broadcast can easily assume the terrifying identity of a violent captor simply by generating a completely anonymous cryptographic receiving string. We are currently witnessing a terrifying and entirely unprecedented era where brutal physical violence flawlessly masks itself behind deeply complex and highly decentralized global networks. This specific tragedy clearly and undeniably demonstrates exactly how the traditional legal system is completely and totally unequipped to successfully pursue violent criminal offenders who possess the sophisticated ability to execute a horrific physical nightmare and subsequently retreat safely behind an impenetrable and untraceable wall of computer code located entirely halfway across the planet. The absolute anonymity currently provided by these decentralized financial structures directly empowers highly opportunistic predators. This was the final moment of reckoning. The absolute deadline imposed by an invisible and ruthless any individual who forcefully took her from her secure home without also deliberately taking her essential daily pill organizers was essentially signing her immediate death warrant. To aggressively terrorize grieving communities with absolutely zero fear of physical apprehension or traditional legal consequence. The profound systemic failure to successfully trace the origin of the digital demands firmly establishes a highly dangerous and completely open precedent for future criminal syndicates looking to aggressively exploit the absolute worst human tragedies for massive financial gain. We must remain exceptionally vigilant and entirely educated about these rapidly emerging digital threats to successfully protect our most vulnerable citizens from such invisible attackers. To this exact passing day, that highly specific string of alphanumeric characters remains entirely visible and completely dormant on the massive public global ledger. It stands as a completely frozen and entirely silent mathematical monument to a deeply unresolved and profoundly senseless human tragedy. The ultimate and most terrifying question still remains completely unanswered by the authorities. Will those dark digital funds ever actually move? Or will that specific anonymous electronic wallet remain a permanent and haunting ghost town, forever floating in the deep digital ether? The absolute truth is constantly hiding directly inside the intricate data, but we must always possess the immense courage required to thoroughly decipher its darkest secrets. This was absolutely not a traditional situation where a captive hostage could be safely hidden away in a remote. Thank you for thoroughly exploring this incredibly complex and completely disturbing analytical investigation alongside me today as we actively seek the absolute truth. I am Ronan. Please remember to stay highly vigilant regarding your personal digital footprint and your immediate physical security in this increasingly unpredictable modern world. Do not forget to gently hit the subscribe button and securely activate your notifications so we can successfully open the very next dark and complex dossier together very soon, right here on Ronan Noir Files. Dark location for several weeks or even months while financial negotiations slowly and methodically progressed. The realistic timeline for her physical survival was strictly measured in mere hours and definitely not in days. The extreme fragility of her specific heart condition explicitly meant that every single agonizing second she spent away from her life, saving, medication drastically reduced her statistical chances of ever coming home alive. Her daily routine was meticulously structured and extremely predictable to anyone who actually knew her well. On the crisp morning of Sunday, February 1st, 2026, the various members of her local devoted congregation eagerly logged on to their personal computers for their regular weekly virtual church service. As the digital grid slowly populated with the smiling faces of the religious community, one specific small screen square remained noticeably and disturbingly dark. Syndicate, demanding an astronomical sum of Bitcoin, had officially expired without a single resolution. Nancy did not successfully connect to the live stream. She did not send a polite message explaining her highly unusual absence. She did not answer her ringing telephone when concerned friends immediately tried to reach her. There was just an incredibly unsettling and dark void exactly where a deeply devout and highly punctual woman absolutely should have been sitting. This sudden and completely unexplained break in her firmly established pattern was the very first silent alarm signaling that something had gone terribly and irreversibly wrong. The missing digital presence on that quiet Sunday morning served as a truly haunting prelude to the massive digital nightmare that would very soon entirely consume her desperate family. Her entire life was a remarkably delicate daily balance, constantly sustained by a ticking mechanical machine buried deep inside her chest. And when she suddenly vanished, that invisible biological clock immediately began ticking loudly toward a catastrophic physiological failure. The people who knew her best immediately recognized that this was not a simple case of forgetfulness. Law enforcement agents and the utterly terrified family members had spent the last agonizing week paralyzed by a terrifying waiting game that offered no relief. A woman whose daily life deeply depends on precise routines does not simply abandon them without a severe external force intervening. The quiet emptiness of her virtual church square was a deafening broadcast of impending tragedy. It set the stage for an investigation where time was the ultimate and most unforgiving enemy. The profound psychological unease, initially sparked by her highly unusual digital absence, very quickly morphed into a truly tangible and horrifying physical nightmare. When local authorities were finally dispatched to her personal residence, located in the highly affluent Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, the initial local law enforcement response was almost immediately escalated under the direct and urgent supervision of Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos. The chaotic scene they immediately encountered upon arrival completely shattered any lingering, desperate hope that Nancy had simply suffered a sudden internal medical emergency or perhaps wandered away from her large property in a state of confusion. The secure exterior of the sprawling home bore the unmistakable and highly violent physical signatures of a deeply aggressive forced entry. Sturdy wood was violently splintered and heavy locking mechanisms were totally compromised, clearly indicating a sudden and intensely aggressive physical breach of her private sanctuary. They had desperately pleaded through official channels for a single irrefutable piece of evidence that the elderly victim was actually still drawing breath. But it was the grim discovery physically located on the ground outside that completely and permanently altered the entire trajectory of the emergency response. Seasoned investigators quickly located highly visible pools of blood outside the immediate perimeter of the residence. This was absolutely not indicative of a minor accidental injury or a simple slip and fall. Detailed forensic laboratory analysis definitively and quickly confirmed that the specific blood found at the crime scene absolutely belonged directly to Nancy Guthrie. The undeniable presence of her fresh blood combined directly with the highly violent signs of forced entry painted a truly terrifying and chaotic picture of a brutal physical struggle. An exceptionally frail 84-year-old woman with a documented and severe heart condition had been violently confronted, physically overpowered, and forcefully removed from her own property entirely against her will. The specialized investigators methodically and carefully swept the entire interior of the quiet house and quickly confirmed their absolute worst medical fears. Nancy was completely gone, but her vital and life-sustaining heart medications remained completely untouched, sitting perfectly organized inside the disrupted residence. They desperately needed a current photograph or a recent voice recording or absolutely any verifiable proof of life. The unknown perpetrators had successfully taken the elderly woman, but they had inexplicably left directly behind the very specific chemical compounds actively keeping her heart beating. This one specific and chilling detail instantly transformed the entire investigation from a standard missing persons case into a wildly desperate rescue mission with an impossibly narrow and rapidly closing window of operational success. Why exactly would an organized attacker deliberately leave behind the essential medication if they truly intended to keep their valuable hostage alive for a protracted and highly lucrative ransom negotiation? The sheer uncalculated violence of the physical extraction seemed completely and totally at odds with the incredibly sophisticated and highly technical extortion plot that was just about to rapidly unfold in the public eye. The blood deliberately left on the pavement strongly suggested a remarkably raw and extremely chaotic crime of opportunity, or perhaps a localized burst of personal anger. However, the specific financial demands that would very soon arrive pointed directly to a meticulously planned international operation flawlessly executed by highly intelligent individuals who strongly preferred to hide quietly behind impenetrable cryptographic walls of code. Before they could even consider authorizing a multi-million-dollar transfer across the complex and decentralized network. This deeply jarring and profound contrast between the visceral, physical brutality of the bloody crime scene and the clinical, emotional detachment of the upcoming digital ransom strategy left seasoned investigators desperately grasping for a single cohesive operating theory. The physical forensic evidence clearly and undeniably proved she was actively bleeding and taken by extreme physical force. But the absolute next phase of the developing crime would rapidly force the seasoned detectives to completely and entirely abandon all of their traditional investigative methods. They could not simply canvass the quiet neighborhood looking for a getaway vehicle when the actual suspects might be operating from a completely different continent. The physical crime scene was essentially a brutal ghost town that offered no clear directional clues. The blood told them exactly how she was violently taken, but it absolutely refused to tell them exactly where she was going. The specialized investigators were standing in the quiet Arizona desert, but the real crime was rapidly migrating into the darkest corners of the internet. The true and highly convoluted nature of this terrifying physical ordeal was finally and dramatically revealed in a manner that completely and intentionally bypassed all standard and expected law enforcement communication protocols. The network, however, remained entirely motionless and indifferent to their suffering. Around February 4th, the agonizing public silence was suddenly broken not by a secret and panicked phone call directly to the grieving family, but by a highly public and incredibly brazen digital broadcast intended for maximum global exposure. Detailed ransom notes demanding multiple millions of dollars were reportedly sent directly to major media outlets, including the massive entertainment platform TMZ and various local television news stations, instead of being safely delivered to the waiting authorities or the Guthrie family through established private channels. The specific financial demands contained within these shocking messages were explicitly clear and technologically deeply daunting for traditional detectives. The unknown perpetrators absolutely did not want unmarked cash dropped in a duffel bag at a remote physical location. They strictly demanded the entire massive ransom be paid exclusively and entirely in untraceable Bitcoin. The digital notes explicitly included a highly specific alphanumeric on-chain wallet address exactly where the digital currency was to be immediately deposited. This was an entirely unprecedented level of public psychological warfare deployed against a civilian family. By actively routing the terrifying demands directly through the aggressive press, the extortionists brilliantly ensured maximum